think, Bob, you raised a really interesting issue of compliance vision in your talk. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about how a company would go about developing and establishing that?
Yeah, I think the issue with compliance is that there are lots of regulations that you need to, a given business needs to pay heed to. Some will be national regulations. If you're a European company, there'll be EU regulations. There'll be regulations that apply to companies that you trade with in the US and other parts of the world. There'll be industry regulations. And you can't possibly look at your IT systems and review them in the light of every different regulation that currently applies to you and ones that are going to come to you in the future you don't know about. The only way to do that is to run your IT systems in such a way that it is generally easy to address the requirements of the different regulations as they come along. And those requirements themselves are not necessarily that complicated. They're often about being able to provide audit trails of what's happened, be able to prove who's used information, what information you have stored where. So providing you can do all those things, it's unlikely that a new regulation will be particularly arduous for you to get control of.
Do you think there's a particular timescale that you should allow to go about that process?
Well, it depends where your starting point is. And quite clearly, if you look at the results of the second poll, about 16% of organisations, of people on this seminar today, feel their organisation is confident about their security policy. They probably have a vision for, dealing with regulations that the other 83% don't. So the 83% have got a bit more of a hill to climb than the 16%. So it depends on your starting point. But the basic building blocks for this are, first of all to do with ID and access management, the sort of stuff Duncan was talking about, knowing who people are, authenticating them, giving them access to information they need to do their jobs. The second thing is understanding what data you hold, where it's held. That's complicated now by the use of cloud computing and all these sort of things, but you still need to know about it. And then linking the two through clearly defined policies. And the starting point for policy is not necessarily technology, it's actually writing it down and making sure it's clear what the policies that apply to your business are, and then working out how best to implement them and link those two things, people and content. And if you haven't started doing that, then you've got quite a lot to do, but it's not unachievable. And there's lots of technology to help you with it, and lots of experts out there who can talk to you about these things.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question here about the manufacturing industry. Duncan, perhaps sure. You could address this for us. How do you secure data security in manufacturing companies where there may not be a standard database? If the data is scattered around without authorizations, how do you go about securing it? Where do you begin?
So we have some excellent examples of particularly relevant to manufacturing organisations where perhaps their research and development function is the lifeblood of their business and maintains their competitive advantage of that information being maliciously or unintentionally leaked. And it goes back to what I was touched on a little bit earlier in our inside-out model, where that very outer layer where we have unstructured data residing in PDF format, Excel spreadsheet, Word document, JPEGs, graphics, video clips, whatever it might be, it's important that we have an information security policy that covers that range of unstructured info. So really information security and information access works in two ways. Identity and access management is about making sure the right people only have the right access at the right time. But for where we can't guarantee that, your other approach really is encryption. So preventing people just absently walking through or maliciously going over and finding a document and being able to read the contents, for example. So in Oracle terms, we have technologies such as our information rights management capability, whereby we can seal up documents such as PDFs perhaps of new product releases or mergers and acquisitions. We can then store those, and at the point at which someone tries to open that or print it or tries to perform any other action, that action is delegated back in terms of its authorization to a central source of policy, which again goes back to the model that Bob and I were talking about earlier. And that central source of policy then says, well, who is the user, what are they trying to do, what are they allowed to do, and then grants or revokes that action accordingly. And it's really that kind of approach which helps protect information that perhaps sits at the perimeter of our estate.
Okay.
Can I just add to that?
Yes,
just very briefly, I mean, it raises a really important point. securing content is not just about databases, it's about unstructured content. And manufacturing organisations are particularly worried about both sorts of content, but quite often unstructured content because they're worried about intellectual property. And there's stacks of examples of employees who work for businesses, manufacturing businesses, heading off to a competitor. There's a case between Intel and AMD, I can't remember the details. One guy taking out a load of stuff and heading in the direction of the other company with a pile of intellectual property he was stealing and intending to take to the competitor. Now that doesn't really do the competitor any good because when it gets exposed, it can damage the competitor. There's another good example in Formula 1 racing where a guy went from one team to another, and that's a direct breach of the rules. So it really is important to get this stuff under control. And one of the things that having a good information management regime in place and understanding what people usually do with content can help you do is to identify anomalous behaviour. So mostly people look at, in a pharmaceutical company, they're mostly looking at the formulas for new drugs on the average of once a week. And suddenly all the guys downloading 30 documents a day about different formulas. It's anomalous behaviour. You can spot it and understand perhaps this guy's up to something, or girl, sorry, and maybe they're just about to head off to a competitor and take that stuff with them. So it is a real concern for manufacturing companies, and that comes out in the research report we're about to publish.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's interesting, one of the examples you mentioned there is a customer that's actually invested in some Oracle technology to prevent that happening again. And really one of the benefits of having a centralised source of policy to determine authorisation is that the point at which that employee leaves the business, either under their own volition or perhaps somebody else's, because the policy is centralised, you can immediately revoke that policy, which means their information access becomes null and void at that point. If the person still had documents stored on their laptop or their home PC in an encrypted format, that's gone with them at that point.
You gave the example of someone deliberately taking content to another organisation. I would imagine there are plenty of examples where it's accidental and unintended. How much of it is training and how much of it is technology?
How do you accidentally steal information, Abigail? I don't know.
I'm thinking of where you're, say, working on your own laptop, you're working on a company laptop, someone else.
Well, that's an important point. I mean, it might be accidental on the employee's part, but it's poor practice on the employer's part. So if, for instance, an employer allows an employee regularly to take confidential information and put it onto their own IT equipment, that is, a breach waiting to happen.
Certainly.
So I mean, it maybe the employee is not to blame there because they've now left and they've taken their laptop with them, but it's remiss of the employer to allow the employee to do that in the first place. And that comes down, first of all, to controlling where data can go. There's also a bit of endpoint management in there, but basically saying, no, you can't take that sort of information because it's too confidential outside of it can't be stored on data assets, on IT assets that we don't have control over. So
it's interesting the point Bob made a bit earlier about spotting the malicious insider, because with the best will in the world, you architect an information security procedure, and even if that is well managed and centralised, the point is if you've got a malicious or a newly malicious employee after 20 years of unblemished service, the only way you can hope to spot that user's change in approach is really through behavioural analysis. And there are tools out in the market now, including from Oracle, that take a heuristic approach to learning what a user's normal behaviour is and then sending off alerts when they see anomalous behaviour. And really that really is the last part of the information security strategy. So it's correctly having the right AAA model, making sure you're encrypting anything for which you don't have a AAA model in place, and then really putting in place a heuristic or detection layer for anything that's changed from the part of the user.
But, encryption is no panacea because providing, it's important to encrypt data on your laptop so that we leave it on the train and it gets stolen, or you encrypt data in transit so it can't be stolen whilst it's in transit. But ultimately, you have to allow people to use data, and to do that, they have to unencrypt it. So if you trust people, you're going to trust them to unencrypt stuff, and then they can still do stuff with it. So encryption is only part of it. It's a big part of it, but encryption doesn't, on its own, solve the problems that we're addressing here. You've got to have
users now.
We've got a question actually about addressing intended risk. If you've got policies and procedures in place, how do you control willful intent if people are, if it's, for example, in a survey, people say, well, I'll just take the data home if I need it. I'm working at home, I've got important work to do, I haven't got time for all this security policy nonsense. How do you address that?
Well,
Bob.
Okay. That's the whole point. You prevent them from taking data where they shouldn't. So you can't stop what's in people's heads. All right. So I was going to say you might think that this malicious employee nicking intellectual properties a one-off or occasional thing. I can guarantee you that most salespeople who move from one job to another try and get out the door with as many sort of leads and contacts as they can, because that's a valuable resource to them. That's just almost normal practice. Now, you can't stop what the salesman walks out the door in his head with, but you can say you're not allowed to copy parts of the customer database to USB devices. You're not allowed to print that sort of material out, so you can actually put controls over printed material. You can say that you can't email these sort of documents. Or at least you can have an audit trail which will say, well, it's quite usual for somebody to download their own pipeline, but while they're downloading somebody else's pipeline, and that would be anomalous behaviour. So you're trying to spot those things, I'm using an example of a salesman, because we all like to knock salesmen, but you can identify when the salesman's doing stuff that you'd expect him to do normally within his job, and identify when there's stuff he shouldn't be doing and prevent it, or at least question it.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, back to the behavioural issue, working with a customer at the moment who's had a 20-year trusted database administrator who, upon retirement, I think it was forced retirement, downloaded a lot of personally identifiable information and tried to sell it on the internet. And when that guy's had 20 years of trusted service, he has the authority to do the things that he's allowed to do. So really, the only way you can manage that is through a detective platform. Preventative approaches in that scenario don't really work, because all they do is limit the employee's ability to do their job. So on a detective basis, you can be looking for anomalous behaviour at various levels in your infrastructure, application and database environment, and spotting the things that seem to stick out a bit like a sore thumb.
How do you manage the cultural aspects of that, employees feeling that they're spied on? Do you have any sort of techniques or strategies that could reassure people working for an organisation?
I think it depends on which of the aspects that we discussed so far you might be talking about. Customers that I'm working with are undertaking information security projects or even re-architectures for a number of reasons. And those can be, compliance, they can be cost-focused, they can be providing competitive advantage because they're offering a service externally on the web that a competitor isn't doing that's well protected, for example. So the way in which, or the reasons as to why people do this vary, and therefore the reasons or the rationale as to how you sell it to your users varies. But equally, on the basis that not everyone needs to know that you're perhaps running a behavioural detection platform, why would you broadcast that kind of message to your employee base and risk that alienation in the first place?
I think it's not that hard to sell. Let's face it, you receive emails every day in your job, and all those emails are filtered to check they're not viruses and don't contain malware, but they're also looking for the occasional bit of pornography that somebody might accidentally send to an employee in your organisation. I mean, businesses are looking at their employees' communications all the time because they have to. And this can be sold as a compromise, because if you want to allow your employees relatively free-ranging access to the internet, to go in, research stuff, find stuff on websites that are useful, or use communications tools like LinkedIn, or look for interesting video clips about competitors on YouTube, whatever it might be. You want to allow all that stuff. It's got to be with the understanding that you're going to have to protect stuff going out. So I think employees will accept the fact that they have to have their activities monitored in order to be able to freely use resources that can be valuable in their job, and also allow them to do a bit of personal stuff as long as it's not too much and is not interrupting with their day-to-day work.
I think security monitoring is a well understood and accepted part of most companies' information security policy. Certainly, a lot of clients that Oracle works with, monitoring of usage of information is a de facto part of their day-to-day role.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to the next question. So a very specific question. So I understand that the question is that I understand that an organisation that loses people's personal data will be liable to increased fines from April of up to £500,000. What new steps should I be putting in place now in order to address this change in the law? I don't know if Duncan, you'd like to start on that one?
I'm not sure it's a question of putting in new steps to specifically mitigate the new legislation. This is legislation that's coming through from the Information Commissioner's Office, where they can prove deliberate misuse or deliberate lack of appropriate controls, which releases personally identifiable or sensitive information into the out from an organisation. And it's really not about mitigating that specific requirement. It's more about ensuring again that the security policy that you have in place, which 16% of our respondents are very confident about, will stand up to the scrutiny of the Information Commissioner's Office should they have a breach and need to prove that they had a well-maintained and up-to-date policy. Bob, would you agree?
Yeah, I was going to say this is pretty easy, really. If you're an IT security manager and you've been to your board last week and said, look, we really need to invest in some new data security tools, and they said that's too expensive, the ante's been up for you. So you can go and say, look, hold on, the fines have gone up to £500,000, pounds a time now, so I really think we need the money to do this. And so, yeah, you've got more leverage over the people who agree IT investment decision making to get them to spend the money, because the costs of not securing your data are going to be much higher when it fails. So it's a tool in your bag, IT managers.
Okay, the next question. How do we convince SMEs to get out of the spreadsheet? Many people still have an entrenched opinion, and companies don't want to invest huge costs in databases, even though there are obviously advantages to doing this. So how do you address that, Duncan?
Well, I'm not sure whether that's an information security question or a user productivity question or I guess a data integrity question. But from an information security perspective, I mean, the answer is you don't need to necessarily move from a spreadsheet model to a database-centric model in order to improve the security of the information that's being held. We talked earlier about being able to encrypt and hence delegate access to a policy source for unstructured documents such as spreadsheets. So from a security perspective, keeping that information in a spreadsheet, provided that spreadsheet's protected, really shouldn't cause us a problem.
Hey, if you're a small business and you're using spreadsheets, and probably the reason is because you think some of the more sophisticated tools are too expensive for you, the answer is they're out there now. You can buy them on subscription over the internet, managed by people who know what they're doing with IT security, who will give you service level guarantees around the way they manage your data. They will back it up. They will make sure that the applications you're relying on are continuously available. So if you really want to move away from spreadsheets, look at some of the online services that are available from applications companies now.
Okay, moving on now to a question about legacy systems. We have a question here. Some of the legacy systems we use don't allow us to implement strong information control from an IT security perspective. If your business highly depends on legacy systems for their day-to-day business, how do you control security when you're constricted technically to implement that security? Duncan?
It would be interesting to know which legacy systems are being discussed here.
Right. Unfortunately, I don't have that much detail.
But I mean, generically, I've never run out of ideas when working with customers as to how to better improve information security. Whether the answer is a technology addition or change, whether it's a people or a process addition or change. There are always controls and compensating controls which we can introduce, and it really depends on the risk appetite of the business.
Do you have perhaps some examples of the types of legacy systems that people have had to deal with?
Well, as an example, I mean, mainframes, are touted as a classic sort of legacy example, and typically when you delve into the bowels of mainframes, you find users stored in rack F. So an immediate challenge might be, well, how do I make sure that I have exactly the right set of current users stored in my rack F profiles? How do I make sure I've got no redundant accounts or ghost accounts? Because these kind of questions will be asked by our regulators if we're subject to SOX, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley. How do I make sure that the privileges associated with those users for the mainframe are appropriate for that person's job as it is today, not what it was 5 years ago? And there are well understood tools in the market, for example, making sure that those users held in the mainframe are accurate and up to date and appropriate for their job. So Oracle provides, for example, user provisioning solutions to do exactly that.
Okay, Bob, do you
I was just going to say for applications themselves, if you've got a legacy application in place which you're not sure about what security vulnerabilities might lie within it, then you can just stick an application firewall in front of it, which is how outsiders can access it. And then once that information's passed through that firewall, which is at the application level, then the data is just data which you treat in the ways we've just been discussing because it's then outside of the application. You know, Duncan's referred to things like, you know, federated IDs across different systems, but that's just what ID and access companies do and specialise in, and that can be extended to mainframes and stuff like that, you know, or however that's done in the background. So I think the tools are out there to address it.
And I think, just to finish that point off, when we talked about Visa earlier, I mean, they had exactly this scenario. They didn't want to re-architect their legacy application at this stage. They wanted to get a better handle on how to manage identities within it. And really, by providing a virtualization layer for identity information above the applications into more of an abstraction layer, they've been able to do that. So they've been able to take the problem away from the application layer and provide a single source of things like user recognition or authentication to requesting sources. So, you know, all these techniques are capable in delivering incremental benefit to customers.
Okay, thank you. Looking towards the education sector now, I've got a question here. I work in the education sector, not financial services. Should I be taking the same approach to security? Bob, perhaps you'd like to address that.
You should be taking a measured approach to security. Educational institutions have a whole different set of things to deal with. They've got to give quite short-term access to students, maybe you know, not even full-time students, part-time students. So you've got to have fairly open IT systems, and you know, within day-to-day use, students aren't going to be accessing that sensitive information, or at least you've got to hide the sensitive stuff from them. So educational institutions, just like banks, will store a lot of personally identifiable information about their students, but they should be very much the internal systems used by administrators. So I guess the big difference of educational institutions is they've got their core systems used by their staff, handling student registration, etc., which need to be protected just as much as a financial institution needs to protect stuff about its customers. And then you've got this big open access requirement for the students just to get access to tools for doing their coursework and stuff like this, which generally isn't going to be about highly secure information. So I think probably the issue that educational institutions have to most face is to differentiate between those two things, so having different levels of access to their IT platforms.
Do you have much concern from the education sector about security?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's perhaps, as Bob said, you know, less about the fact that educations are typically providing access and authorization of access to their information assets for internal users such as students and staff, where, you know, highly sensitive information is probably not being held in the general domain. But equally, you know, they're very attractive targets for you know, social engineering attacks, phishing, farming, etc. And really the basic approach to providing good authorization is the same for a school or university as it is for any other organisation. It's understanding who our users are, and on that basis deciding what they are and what they're not allowed to do. Interestingly, the education sector, perhaps at sort of higher education level, it has some things in common with perhaps Ministry of Defence, for example, where users can hold different roles but still be the same person. So I might be both a postgraduate student but also a lecturer, also serving on the university senate, and that then implies some different levels of what I'm authorised to do depending on what function I'm performing at any one time. So there has been some intricacy in the authorisation procedures for higher education, which really has driven some development in that area.
Okay. I've got a question here which is very brief, but I think it sort of captures some of the challenges that people are undergoing. Is how do we implement the policies? I don't know, if Bob, if you want to sort of recap perhaps on some of the issues we talked about earlier, but talk about them in a bit more depth.
Well, what's starting to happen in the IT security industry is, if you think of, we've been talking about ID and access management, talking about users, people will be familiar with LDAP type directories where you can go and you can find out information about users, you can authenticate them, find out their details, and find out what their rights are. We're now starting to see a similar sort of thing grow up around policies. So you have policy engines. So these policy engines are centralized repositories for policy. It's not nearly as advanced as the sort of stuff I just talked about with users. Often, an organization will have 3 or 4 different policy engines because it's implemented one thing for endpoint security, another thing for data leak prevention and stuff like that. But slowly, it's coming together. So it should be possible to define centralized policies that have been written down and apply them to different technologies that you can use. And I don't want to, particularly whilst we're at a seminar sponsored by Oracle, mention some other vendors, but I do know, and I'm sure Duncan will answer on behalf of those vendors. Well, I'm thinking of McAfee's e-policy orchestrator as an example, where they put in place a central policy engine which third parties can link into, and anybody can pull policy from. So it's starting to happen. But the questioner's question is a good one because it is still a problematic area, and it's a good question to ask.
Absolutely. If we're talking about information security policy, and you and the listener or the watcher agrees with my premise that information security is really all about authorization, then we're talking about authorization policy. An authorization policy absolutely can be centralized. So if you go to oracle.com and look up Oracle Entitlements Server, Entitlements Server does what it says on the tin. It provides entitlements decisions based on what the user is trying to do. And that is basically evaluated against a policy or set of policies held at the server. And then by delegating authorization from all of our end applications, so for example, Oracle E-Business Suite, perhaps our database administrators, perhaps our email administrators, so that those applications say when I need to authorize a user's request, I go to this central policy source, and the policy says, well, for this request they have to be an employee, and it has to be between the hours of 9 and 5:30, and they have to have an enterprise-based IP address, i.e. be on site. Then that's a fairly simple access policy which can be implemented centrally and then consumed by all of our target applications. So the implementation of policy, is best done centrally. It's best done simply to begin with. And it really comes back to this declarative security approach, which we talked about earlier, rather than programmatic, where ultimately it would have to have been the application making that decision.
Okay, thank you. Next question I have here is, my organisation's planning to do business outside of Europe for the first time. What additional or different security issues should I consider when sharing my systems with non-European partners and suppliers? Would you like to address that one? Do you have any examples perhaps you could give us there?
Yeah, for sure. So the first question is, well, where are you planning to do business? And on that basis, the question then becomes, well, what are the locally enforceable legislative requirements of that geography? So, for example, I know that some online gaming companies have real challenges in being able to manage access to their online gaming services, because effectively they're given a license to provide gambling services to a very specific geography, which in cities can be right down to street and house number level. And if they are able to be proven that somebody else outside that geography has accessed their service, then they're liable to be fined. So there's one side of the access side. Also, I guess the question from an InfoSec perspective is, when we take information beyond Europe or beyond even our own enterprise, we should only really be shipping out information in clear format where it's necessary in order to have the end user understand it. So if it's being offshore just to provide an offshore development resource, for example, then provide obfuscated or masked data to the offshore service so they can test and develop in exactly the normal procedure, but they're not using identifiable information that's being shipped out from our core database.
Bob?
I mean, to be honest, if you're just starting to do business, let's say in the USA, to pick somewhere, and you're selling stuff to people in the USA, there's no issue whatsoever. Best of luck to you. Sell them the stuff, take the order, and store your customers' details on your systems. It's more an issue for USA regulators if they're worried about their citizens having their data stored overseas as customers, but I don't think that's a huge issue. I expect what's lying behind this question is the thing about safe harbour, which there are regulations that say certain types of data cannot be stored outside of a certain legislative area. Generally, for European-based businesses, the European Union's okay. And there's certain types of data, which I can't remember all the details now, that you've got to be careful if you're storing stuff in the US, possibly. But there's safe harbour agreements between the US and the European Union, so generally that's not an issue. For instance, if you were using a system like Salesforce.com, a well-known, fairly well-known anyway, software as a service application that's provided over the internet for managing your customer details, all their infrastructure is in the United States. But there's loads of different government institutions and commercial organisations who are using that service because there's, I think, in fact, actually, they use Swiss law when you sign an agreement with them. I think that's where their headquarters are, theoretically. So there are issues, but generally speaking, it's talked about. It becomes a higher profile in discussions than the real problem that underlies it. So.
Okay, thank you. I've got a follow-up question actually here on something we talked about earlier. For asking for clarification on the policy engine, what exactly you meant by that. Perhaps you could sort of explain a little bit further, Duncan.
So in the context we were talking about earlier, a policy engine really is a centralised service which can be queried in order to make an entitlements decision. So am I allowed or am I not allowed to perform the request that I'm asking for? So really, as an example, let's say I'm logging into Oracle Business Suite. And very simply, Oracle Business Suite can authenticate me as a user because it has my username and password. And then I try and log into the HR module within that. Rather than take that decision within eBusiness Suite, the eBusiness Suite can contact the entitlement server or the policy engine and say, user Duncan Shaw's is trying to access the HR module. Is he or is he not allowed to do that? And the policy engine will have the policy related to HR module access stored within it. It will know who I am because I've authenticated to the business suite, and it will say yes or no. And it will send that result back to a business suite, which will then allow me or deny me access accordingly. And really that policy engine is no more than a set of policies coded in any normal approach to developing policy, but held centrally and maintained centrally. And the benefit therefore being that you don't have to maintain those same set of policies discretely in each of your target systems which are querying it.
Okay, thank you very much for fleshing that out. The next question is, it refers back to one of the poll questions actually, which is really, how often should I review my security policy?
I guess it depends on who you are.
I think it's a bit, I'm afraid it's a bit like painting the fourth road bridge. It's a continuous thing. I think what I pointed out in my presentation, it needs to be reviewed in the light of three things. So it needs to be reviewed in the light of new regulations, it needs to be reviewed in the light of new business processes, and it needs to be reviewed in the light of new security threats. So if any of those things become a high profile activity in your organisation, there's regulation that affects you, you're deploying some big new business process, or you're aware of a big threat that's become a menace to your organisation, then check your security policy against it. So it's probably going to be event-driven rather than something you just do automatically every 3 months or something like that.
I think a good place to start is perhaps with the auditors of the business, be they internal or external. So the people who are charged with making sure the business is operating within good governance, they should be able to tell you, what they would expect as good governance given your type of organisation and your peer level status.
Okay, great. Right, we are close to the hour, but we have time for just one more question, which is, I have an increasing number of remote workers in my organisation. How do I effectively manage information security without limiting their ability to do their jobs? Do you want to approach that, Bob?
There's two issues there. First is endpoint security. So you're sitting there with a notebook computer, and if you take that home, that's an asset that belongs to your organisation. Therefore, they've still got a right to control what you can do on it, and you can put stuff on the actual, software on the actual device that says you can do this, you can't do that. But the other thing is extending policy around, say, internet usage and email content to you as a user outside of the office, regardless of whether it's on that device or a mobile phone. And that can be done through always forcing access to the internet through a proxy that acts as the internet and enforces policy around its use. And quite often these days that's going to be some sort of in the cloud resource. So you can extend all the sorts of things you've been talking about to users wherever they happen to be, if they're using even if they're using assets of their own, hardware assets of their own to access IT, because as soon as they're inside your environment, perhaps through some SSL VPN link, then you can apply the policy and the security things to them. So it's achievable.
Okay, Duncan, do you have anything to add to that?
No, very briefly, just that authorisation policy, just as we talked about it being applied internal to the organisation, ought to have an external representation too. So your access and authorisation policies really should reflect the fact that the workforce is changing and be able to cater for that whilst still providing people what they need to do the job.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So on behalf of our audience, I'd like to thank Bob and Duncan for your answers today. I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for taking time to discuss security with us. I hope you found the answers helpful. Just one last thing to ask you to do, and that's take a quick look at the feedback tab on the screen in front of you and give us some feedback on the session. We really do find the responses helpful, so if you could spare 30 seconds or so just to give us your feedback, we would really appreciate that. With our service, basically, our service to you. Okay, the final, what I have to say finally is that we've been talking today about security in the modern business. I'd like to thank our panellists for their contributions. You've heard from Bob Tarzi, who's Analyst and Director at Quocirca, and Duncan Shores, Information Security Specialist at Oracle. Thank you for attending this web seminar. We hope you found it informative. Don't miss our next computing web seminar entitled Preparing for Enterprise Scale Windows 7 Migration, which is on Thursday the 18th of February at 1500 GMT. You can register now at computing.co.uk/events. Thank you and goodbye.